Good morning. My name is Charles Fridge. I am the chairman and CEO of Verde CO2. We are a private company here based in the United States, corporate offices in Houston, Texas, and we focus exclusively on permanent sequestration of CO2 from port source emissions. I'm excited to be speaking at this year's CarbonExpo. This is going to be a sort of abbreviated presentation. Clearly not every consideration for implementing or implementing, looking at risks of a CCS project can we address today. And I'm excited to speak with any of you in the Q&A session, which I believe is this afternoon. I'm going to share a presentation and we will work through from there. Great. So the subject of my presentation is evaluating and implementing a successful CCS project. As I mentioned before, we can't cover every subject, but what I'm going to try to do today is cover some of the foundational elements that are required. We're going to talk a little bit about sequestration locations or sinks, as well as regulatory considerations, emitter considerations, cost of capture for different industries right now. We're going to talk a little bit about the economics of 45Q pre and post IRA, and any other commercial considerations, a few of them that are, some of them are obvious and some of them are a little nuanced. Without going on too much about Verde CO2, I did want to introduce our team a little bit. Verde is a private company, as mentioned. We are very well capitalized, and we have been in business since 2019. We have a large and diverse set of projects throughout the United States. We have a lot of focus recently in the Gulf Coast, but as you'll see from some of our projects, we've worked in California, Wyoming, New Mexico, and the Illinois basin as well. Most of our attendees of this conference in the oil and gas industry, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about subsurface considerations. I'm going to hit on it briefly. I think one thing that is not addressed publicly by a lot of folks are environmental, social, and economic justice considerations. The EPA takes it very seriously, as we all should. Next to having a commercially viable project, the two most foundational considerations for any CCS project are going to be, one, can we safely store CO2 in the sink or in the location that we're looking to? But two, can we be responsible stewards in our actions? And that means not only keeping the CO2 safely underground and safe to the environment, but also that our projects protect those that live near our sites and they don't disproportionately affect any one group or party. Briefly on Verde CO2, John Grimmer, who is our president, is a 20-plus year oil and gas executive, started with one of the super majors and spent a lot of time in private equity. Nikhil Joshi is one of the foundational CCS members of our community who's recently joined our team. At Verde, we have full in-house geoscience and operational folks. We'll talk a little bit about partnerships, which are very important, but we do all of our own internal geoscience work as well. Verde has worked since 2019 throughout the United States. In the last several years, we have been focusing extensively in the Gulf Coast region. We have two Class 6 well applications opened with the EPA, which is Region 6 out of Dallas, run by Charles McGuire. As most of you are aware, both the state of Louisiana, the LDNR, run by Steve Lee, as well as the Railroad Commission in Texas are seeking primary authority. As a regulatory consideration, any applications to inject will require copying both organizations, both the EPA in Dallas as well as these organizations. One of the key components of a successful business in CCS is making sure that you have paired with the right emission source. And so that's going to be a big consideration that we're going to discuss today. Let's talk first and foremost about sort of the building blocks of these types of projects. For a company like ours, and we'll talk about the capture equipment, it all starts with the command of the geoscience. Having the sink identified is the foundational and well characterized as one of the foundational considerations. Now, emitter selection and source to sink matching have massive economic effect on any project. We'll talk in a moment about different types of emissions, and we'll talk about the different concepts between a hub concept versus a discrete emitter, point source emitter, to a location where you intend to sequester. Getting those locations close extremely have a huge impact. Some of the times up to 30 to 35% of the total CapEx of the project can be the midstream component. One of the more important things to the EPA and state organizations are mature wellbore avoidance and remediation. That has to do with the containment of the CO2. Clearly, financial optimization is an important part of the correct debt to equity ratios. You have to have regulatory proficiency. There's over 14 permits required, starting with stratigraphic test wells, working with environmental agencies, and your ultimate injection wells. Finally, litigation management, as anyone who spends any time on this and looks at the Code of Federal Regulations for a Class 6 well will tell you, the EPA has requirements, and there is a budding and evolving insurance industry. Right now, some of it's very expensive, but there's definitely products out on the market for CO2 recapture insurance. Point source emissions are one of the more important aspects of CO2 capture and sequestration. Large projects like coal-fired power plants, natural gas cogen facilities emit massive amounts of CO2. The capture equipment, by all standards, is extremely expensive. There's great partnerships with EPCs throughout the United States that have built this. Again, we're using technology right now. Traditional amine-based cooling tower technology is what Verde CO2 has been focused on, although there's fantastic new technologies coming out, membrane technologies and others, that will reduce costs considerably. The CapEx and OpEx of these have got to come down on some of these industries, even post-IRA, for the projects to be financially viable. Now, ethanol, ammonia, commonly referred to as pre-combustion sources, are mostly pure CO2, so the capture cost is very low. However, with that, the trade-off is most of those emissions are much smaller than post-combustion sources. Partnerships in any type of these developments are going to be very important, be it if it's a large oil and gas company, an independent company, or otherwise. At Verde, we have partnered with University of Texas, BEG, University of Houston, LSU. There are academic organizations and academics that have spent 20, 30 years studying permanent sequestration, a business that we're just frankly now finding financially viable thanks to government incentives, principally with 45Q as well as voluntary offsets. As I mentioned earlier, the EPA, one of the largest considerations they have right now, secondary to safety and protecting underground drinking water with the seal or confining zone, is making sure that each developer has implemented an environmental and social justice policy. Most of that leads off initially with stakeholder engagement, and that's something that any developer has to do. At Verde, we've reached out to local communities. We have implemented plans not only with local governments, but also with local schools and education, making sure that the general public is aware that what we're doing has been done in this country since the 1970s. Capturing CO2 and injecting it downhole is something that we have to get word out to the public in general. There are a lot of organizations that view carbon sequestration, even if you're not an oil and gas company, as a device just to keep oil and gas companies producing hydrocarbons. That's not true. I think we all agree that carbon sequestration is going to be a necessary and required business industry to allow necessary heavy industry like steel, cement, agricultural products to continue to operate. And so making sure that you can articulate as a developer a plan to the EPA, a plan to the Railroad Commission, a plan to the LDNR, that you are going to have stakeholder engagement, allow community involvement, and listen to any of those concerns is going to be integral. I can't say enough about this, but I only have 20 minutes to speak, so I'm going to move on quickly. Each project that Verde has worked on is very nuanced. This is a general CCS framework that Verde works under. There are projects that Verde is advancing right now and agreements we've entered into where the emitter company wants to create and oversee their carbon capture equipment, build their own carbon capture island. We've entered into agreements with some of the largest midstream companies to handle the carbon transportation. And really where we lie in is our command of the subsurface. And we handle the sequestration, the monitoring, reporting to the regulatory agencies, and the verifying that the CO2 is remaining where we said it was going to be. There are certain aspects that some emitters want turnkey. They would like to have turnkey proposals and turnkey execution, where Verde undertakes to partner with certain EPCs and build the capture equipment. There's got to be a lot of flexibility in this business. And so being nimble is going to be an important part to developing any project. Let's talk briefly about the CCS timeline. A Class 2 injection well, as probably most everyone watching this presentation is aware, is for the disposal of naturally occurring oil field waste. That is a great opportunity to start a CCS project, from a capture from an oil field processing plant, et cetera. That process can be, we believe, obtained, and you can be injecting within 12 months. But our typical timeline for a project from start to finish can last 3 to 4 years, potentially, depending on how far along we are in the beginning. Once we've identified our emission source and our sink or our depository location, we have to acquire pore space rights. You might have to acquire, depending on your injection zone, mineral rights as well, depending on if there are producing wells above or below your intended injection zone. The EPA's offices throughout the country, and definitely Region 6, which we work closely with, are highly staffed with fantastic and capable geoscience teams. Contrary to some comments we've heard before about the speed in which the EPA is moving right now, we believe that they're moving very efficiently. The EPA is citing 18 to 24 months from the time your application is deemed administratively complete. And the process for deeming an application administratively complete is laid out in the Code of Federal Regulations. Some of the things, as you're probably all well aware from the attendees of this meeting, are the drilling of a successful stratigraphic test well to confirm with core and other tests the size of the confining zone or seal, full and whole cores out of the injection zones, as well as other required information. 3D seismic, we believe, is necessary to assess any sequestration site. So either shooting new 3D seismic data, which can be time consuming, or acquiring and reprocessing to implement into first a static and then a dynamic model for the EPA to show where your CO2 and where your area view or AOR is going to be is integral. Briefly, only a couple of slides on subsurface because of the attendees of this conference. The EPA is concerned with three things: storage capacity, which is obviously the overall aerial extent and volumetrics that can be pumped in; reservoir quality, which influences injectability and conformity of the plume distribution; but last but not least, containment, which is seal quality. And seal quality can be affected by faulting. And moreover, what we see the most of is the existence of historic wellbores, either producing or non-producing wellbores. This is a schematic of a problem with many mature oil and gas fields. If you're injecting into a sandstone or a saline formation beneath or above historical oil and gas production, the EPA, as we all should be concerned, to make sure that we are not releasing CO2 uphole into underground drinking water, is concerned with these type of mature oil fields. So one of your considerations in implementing a CCS plan is how many wellbores are within my AOR, and more importantly, how many are going to reach plume contact with CO2. There can be behind pipe flow from old wellbores, even P&A wellbores. Insufficient P&A that's left open hole through the injection zone and up through the confining zone is never going to work with the EPA, and nor should we consider it working because of the risk associated with it hitting with your CO2 coming up hole and hitting underground drinking water. All right, let's talk briefly about some commercial concepts. 45Q is clearly the largest driver of the economics behind developing a carbon sequestration project. Verde focuses exclusively on permanent sequestration. That avails us to higher 45Q rates, although the IRA did increase 45Q rates for enhanced oil and gas recovery, as well as other qualified use projects. This is an incentive credit, as we're all well aware that we got direct pay for 5 years. However, there's under the current 12-year life of 45Q, you will have to take in consideration whether or not your company or one of your partners has tax appetite. There have not been many, if any, tax equity partnerships done with 45Q. The voluntary offset credit market is growing every day. We at Verde have worked with numerous verifiers and agencies on these. They are a product that we think will absolutely increase the value of your project for companies that are trying to reach their net zero goals. And it is one of these budding and evolving industries. In California, you can avail yourself to the low carbon fuel credits for capture, for instance, under the innovative fuel standard. Unfortunately, the LCFS market has gone down in price in the last several years, so that's a consideration in doing business in California, although there's some great projects in California. Timeline briefly, I always find this interesting. Most people think that carbon sequestration has been basically developed, or a business model has been developed entirely during a Democratic White House. That's actually not the case. California LCFS was born under the administration of Governor Schwarzenegger, and the Bipartisan Budget Act, as well as the initial clarification of 45Q, actually started during Republican administrations. The Biden Infrastructure Investment Job Act was obviously started under the Biden administration, and of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a big boost to our business in general. Major changes to the IRA and the effects they've had on our business have been not only the increase in 45Q, but also several other factors. Previously, we had minimal thresholds for different types of emissions that have been reduced to very small numbers. That has made our business very viable for looking at projects and advancing projects with emitters that previously did not have enough emissions to qualify for 45Q. There clearly have been some changes to electricity capture. So we all saw this last week. There's been a new DOE announcement for an additional $2.5 billion, targeting some of our electrification industries that are run on natural resources. That is really going to help fast track a lot of projects for developers, including Verde. Right now, if you look at the costs, typical costs of the CapEx and OpEx for a natural gas cogen facility capture equipment, it is marginally economic, even at current rates of permanent sequestration, for those to work. So we hope that, again, we're rooting for all of our business partners out there that have new technologies, new solvents, as well as different types of membrane and other technology for capturing CO2. And we applaud the current administration for increasing the DOE federal dollars to help decarbonize and really set a standard for electricity, coal, and natural gas generation. Getting low on time, so I won't spend much time with low carbon fuel credits. Those of you that are developing or looking at projects in California, there's a little bit of a regulatory difference there. It's not as difficult as some folks think. They have their own version of NEPA as well there. And the San Francisco office of the EPA they have their own office there. The California LCFS program really can boost a project and make it financially viable to move forward with a project in California. As I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, the LCFS market in the last 12 months has dropped considerably. So it's one of those things that you have to consider when looking at developing a project. Briefly on other financial requirements, as I mentioned previously, the EPA has a qualifying financial instrument required with any developer who is filing an application to inject for a Class 6 well. There are numerous products that are coming out there right now. Originally, some of the first products that we were pricing were almost cost prohibitive. So self-insurance was sort of a requirement. However, Like most industries, they've gotten efficient and the market price is coming down. Most of your oil and gas insurance companies can direct you to the right insurance company for some of these. So key takeaways that I wanted to leave us with today. The single largest influencer of any project is obviously the volumes of CO2 that you can inject into the ground. Those large projects are very beneficial if you can get the capture and OpEx down, but they're capitally intensive. So most companies can't afford to do them on their own. There's plenty of infra funds that once you've reached FID and have secured an injection well, will invest. Some of those considerations are minimum volume commitments from the emitter, which are going to, of course, require some sort of a take or pay from you as the developer. Small projects are much more fundable, but unfortunately, they carry with it base costs that you can't do away with. A pipe is going to cost the same amount of a pipe per mile based on volumes. Obviously, you can size it up or down. Right of way is going to cost the same amount. So a larger project gives you economies of scale, stating the obvious, but like a hub project. But smaller projects can be very financially viable if the source to sink matching is close enough. Again, CO2 transmission line costs account for most of the cost of a project beyond 15 to 20 miles. And we at Verde are currently advancing several hub-based CCS projects. Again, it's about the efficiencies of scale. So this is what I wanted to cover in our short amount of time. I do look forward to the question and answer section that we have later on in the day. I appreciate your time, and please feel free to attend the Q&A session. Thank you for your time.